America was founded. You look at Thomas Jefferson writing to Madison in revolt of British aristocracy. The American Revolution was against the billionaires of their time. And we are declaring independence from such an extreme marriage of wealth and power and the state that the voices of everyday people did not exist.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafseli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. In just a few short weeks, these United States will be turning 250 years old. A quarter millennium ago, the European settlers, who had by then colonized much of the eastern seaboard of the North American landmass, decided to break with the English metropole and set out on their own. Why did they do that? Among other things, the Declaration of Independence, the supposed urtext of liberal egalitarianism, complained that the British had been provoking attacks from the, quote, merciless Indian savages, unquote, on the frontier. Or at least so wrote the slave-holding Thomas Jefferson, with the same pen that wrote that, quote, all men are created equal. Despite the retrospective revisionism that would come later, this was a settler revolt. 250 years later, it's hard to say that the nation's character has changed that dramatically.
The White House has marked this momentous occasion with a celebration right out of the fall of Rome, with a gigantic arena being built on the White House lawn, an array of metal taller than the very presidential compound itself, in order to host the Ultimate Fighting Championships Freedom 250 event, in which Diego Lopez defeated Steve Garcia with a knockout, if you care about any of that.
While the nationalist celebrations of the right are predictably garish and hit that special mix of nostalgia for the old hierarchies and hyper-modern consumer slop, the legacy of 76 is not their domain alone. Politicians on the left side of the aisle have continued the tradition, dating back to Abraham Lincoln, of projecting backwards onto the founding and national identity that simply did not exist. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the presumptive standard bearer for the electoral left headed into 2028, described the founding as a revolution fought by the nascent USians against the billionaires of their time. And more broadly, politicians on the left have sought to rally support around the idea of patriotic socialism, namely that all the enslavement, genocide, settler expansion, and empire were unfortunate missteps, growing pains for the global beacon of democracy.
Now, I understand why American politicians, particularly left-wing ones, have to say these kinds of things, but it does lead to certain perceptions about the malleability of American institutions. And I think, more critically, doesn't make it true. And we, in the broader public, I think have an obligation to be honest about the United States, its history, and its role in the world if we want things to actually change in the long term, not just in the short term.
Somehow, though, this remains a challenge, even and perhaps particularly so for orthodox Marxists, who view the colonization of the US as historically progressive and the founding as a major bourgeois revolution, one mighty step on the road to communism. You don't hear that so much, at least not from most Marxists, about the colonization of Palestine, even though the early Zionists spoke the language of revolution. In that case, it seems relatively self-evident that when the primary victims of your quote-unquote national liberation struggle are the land's indigenous population, you can't really claim the mantle of historical progress. Of course, the Israelis and American Zionists are quick to point it out. Don't you, they love to say, also live on colonized land? A key concept from our guest today's work, which extends through many of his books and appears in several titles, is the counter-revolution. In fact, his description of US history is really a series of counter-revolutions dating all the way back to the founding. On this telling, the major historical thrusts leading to the present were consolidations of power formed in reaction to the insurgent power and revolutionary momentum of the global oppressed. Slave rebellions, labor uprisings, and indigenous resistance. What I really appreciate about this account is that it simultaneously refuses to sugarcoat what have been deemed the modernizing forces of history, while retaining historical agency for the broader underclass. If US history is a sequence of counter-revolutions warding off the radical potential of a true anti-colonial movement, politics is the project of causing just one counter-revolution to fail.
Our guest today has devoted his life's work to correcting that historical record when it comes to slavery, colonialism, and the character of the United States. Dr. Gerald Horne. He is the Moores Professor of History at the University of Houston and has authored countless great books about this subject, most notably The Counter-Revolution of 1776, and most recently, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we are speaking with the illustrious Dr. Gerald Horne, the Moores Professor of History at the University of Houston and the author of many, many books and the winner of the Frantz Fanon Lifetime Achievement Award. Dr. Horne, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Turbulence.
Thank you for inviting me.
So it's now been 40 years since the publication of your first book, Black and Red, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Afro-American Response to the Cold War. And since then, you have written dozens of historical works, I think hundreds of articles, the subjects of which span 5 centuries and at least as many continents. It is an immensely impressive body of work. And well, I cannot say that I have read through it all, though I would one day like to be able to say that. Several things stand out to me. One is a thematic or substantive continuity that broadly fits within a settler colonialism analytic. Modernity in your work is the story not of a progressive enlightenment gradually actualizing itself in some kind of grand teleology. Instead, our world has been forged by conflicting forces, those of colonial conquest and those of the resistance on the part of the dispossessed. The other thing that stands out to me, which is, of course, related to this, is a methodological commitment to writing history from below, from the vantage not of history's victors, quote unquote victors, but from the perspective of those, the global majority, who must face these forces head on. I personally would call this historical materialism, but I would love to hear how you characterize both your method as a historian and what you see as the purpose of writing history.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, I will not dispute your term historical materialism insofar as, A, I'm looking at conflict oftentimes, and conflict oftentimes presupposes so-called winners and losers. I think that if you look at North America in particular, which has been the locus of a good deal of my work, there has been a dispossession of the indigenous population, which should be obvious, but sometimes is ignored or swept aside when one is talking about the history of North America and the supposed grand results that eventuated post 1492. I'm also looking significantly at conflict between the enslavers and the enslaved. And what's interesting about the United States of America is that even folks on the left who supposedly privilege the idea, for example, of class conflict, when it comes to pivotal and instrumental moments in the history of what eventuated in the creation of the United States of America, class conflict gets swept under the rug, even though we know that the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of the enslaved population, by significant degrees did not support the revolt against British rule and disproportionately fought alongside the redcoats. Now, that bakes into the cake of the creation of the United States a fundamental conflict. That is to say, a significant percentage of the population was not supportive of what many consider to be this great leap forward for humanity, speaking of the creation of the United States of America. And that leads to a separation between the past and the present. That is to say, I find it remarkable when one talks about the Black population in particular and the rather terrible life outcomes in terms of disproportionately incarcerated, disproportionately cited on death row, disproportionately victimized by police brutality and terror. Somehow that is not connected to the origins of the so-called republic. That is to say, if you fight on the losing side, speaking of the redcoats, and do not prevail, you can expect to be penalized and pulverized. And that leads to these terrible life outcomes until you're able to turn the tables, which the Black population was able to do by internationalizing the struggle, first with the Haitian Revolution, and we can trace that, if we have time, throughout the late 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries and into the 21st centuries. But that also leads to a kind of disappointment as well with regard to what is happening today.
Thank you for that. I think it would be good to dig a bit deeper on what you started out by talking about, which is the American Revolution. Now, of course, one of your more controversial interventions within the history more broadly has been about the role of slavery in motivating the conflict between the early American settlers and the British metropole that ultimately resulted in the Revolutionary War and the founding of the United States. And setting aside the other motivations that existed, I think at this point, it is pretty much beyond dispute that the founders themselves were very much invested in the enslavement of Africans for their labor and the dispossession of indigenous Americans for their land. And that no one at the time of the founding understood, for example, the Declaration of Independence to mean anything otherwise. And you mentioned the class conflict that is inherent in the rebellion or uprising of the enslaved. But I'm curious how you assess the early mobilizations, not of the colonial ruling class, but of the white working class against the state governments. And I ask this because I think that there's like a lot of discussion now about reviving the spirit of the American Revolution or kind of turning it towards more socialist ends or what have you. And interestingly enough, that's never grounded in the class conflict that you mentioned. It's always that there is this kind of like latent class identity really in the white working class. So I'm curious, like what you make of those movements, right? You know, I mean, you had the movement to secure a kind of more egalitarian Pennsylvania state constitution in 1776. And then about a decade later, you had Shays' Rebellion. Do you think that there was any truly egalitarian potential in those movements, or were they always going to be corrupted by the wages of whiteness? And as such, were they always going to be destined to be the basis of something like the Jacksonian democracy that would go on to absorb them?
Well, I won't necessarily use the term destined, but I will not dispute that term as well. But once again, in terms of connecting the past and the present, I mean, I think one of the reasons we study history, we study the past so we can understand the present. And if you're trying to understand how 77 million people voted for Donald J. Trump in 2024, it does little good to say that in a country of 330 million, that was all due to the 1%, because the numbers don't add up. That is to say that it's apparent that Mr. Trump had a kind of working class base and a kind of middle class base with regard to the descendants of the original settlers. And that brings me to the other point, which is that I find it ironic nowadays that oftentimes our friends on the left in particular, when they seek to understand what's happening in historic Palestine, they invoke the term settler colonialism. But they don't necessarily invoke that term with regard to North America, for example. I'm surprised that the Israeli patriots have not accused them of anti-Semitism, for example. And if you look at settler colonial projects, which I've done, I mean, I've written books on settler colonialism in Kenya, settler colonialism, the precursor of Zimbabwe, speaking of Rhodesia, settler colonialism in South Africa, they all involve a certain kind of class collaboration, which is the flip side of class struggle and class conflict. I have a book coming out within about 6 months on the Pacific Northwest, the states of Washington and Oregon in the United States, and comparing it to British Columbia across the border. And what's striking about the settler incursions in the 1840s and the 1850s is that oftentimes those demanding the land of the indigenous were not only the 1%, but it was also the poorer classes, for example, of settler descendants. And I think that that's important, particularly in trying to understand the so-called Jacksonian democracy, because in many ways, that was the epitome of class collaboration. In one of my books, I talk about how, with regard to so-called Indian removal under President Andrew Jackson, as I understand it, one of the favorite presidents of Mr. Trump, that the Cherokees in particular, who occupied a good deal of what is now the southeast quadrant of the United States of America, had sought to assimilate with regard to Christianity, with regard to written alphabet for their language. They have newspapers, which you can find in different repositories and different archives, and also in terms of enslaving Africans, also in terms of sedentary agriculture, for example. But they still had to go. And oftentimes you had European settlers, figuratively fresh off the boat, moving into their mansions. All they have to do is sort of sweep before they move in with a nice broom. And it's little wonder that many people became attached to what they call the American dream, because in recent years, how often can one land in a country and move into a mansion, for example? So I would be the last person to disparage the idea of class struggle. In fact, in one of my books, class struggle is in the title. But at the same time, it would be fatuous to act as if class collaboration does not exist, particularly when we know that it's an emblem of settler colonialism, which tends to organize the descendants across class lines. And in my book on the 16th century, for example, where I talk about the first London incursion into what they call North Carolina in the 1580s, I have sources that talk about the heterogeneous class mixture of those who cross the Atlantic, for example. And I think that this failure to look at class collaboration, it complicates and complexifies the ability to understand, for example, anti-Semitism. What happens is that there is oftentimes a reversion to what I would call the propaganda of 1776 and this proclamation of civil liberties and civil rights, which was then able to incorporate the Jewish population, when actually under settler colonialism, there was an effort to recruit, going beyond the common bigotries of Europe, recruit those who would fight the indigenous population and help to keep the enslaved in line. And which is one of the reasons why some of the first Jewish elected officials, or those who would be called Jewish elected officials. I'm thinking of Senator David Yulee, the antebellum senator from Florida. I mean, he was born to Jewish parents, but he did not necessarily embrace their religion. Or Senator Judah P. Benjamin of Louisiana, who went on to become the so-called brains of the Confederacy. It's interesting that Jewish elected officials, or those who we would call Jewish elected officials, were much more prone to be found in the South than in the North. I'm talking about the antebellum period. And I ascribe that to the fact that some of the bitterest contestations were in the South, particularly in Florida, for example, which was subjected to so-called Indian removal, where you had three bitter wars, oftentimes denoted as the so-called Seminole Wars, although there were more Native Americans beyond those we would call the Seminoles who were involved. And of course, Senator Yulee was part of a militia. And there was a sort of merger of the enslaved population and the indigenous population, which made these wars quite tremendous. And in my aforementioned book on the Pacific Northwest, one of the reasons the state of Oregon tried to bar Negroes. Portland today has one of the smallest Black populations of any big city in the United States of America as a legacy of that antebellum process, was because they thought that the Negroes coming to Oregon would be uniting with the Palouse, the Cayuse, the way they did in Florida, for example. So the better part of wisdom was to bar them all together. Now, of course, when you have these provisions barring Negroes, some of our liberal and even radical friends say, oh, that's anti-slavery. No, I mean, excuse me for laughing, but it is laughable.
I'm glad you brought up the comparison points between Israel and American history, because I did want to guide things to the present in a little bit. Those defending Israel are known to be something of political chameleons, adapting and co-opting all kinds of different political causes, no matter how contradictory, all in service of sustaining and supporting the state. And Zionist organizations around 1948 would promote the then nascent state to Jewish donors in the United States by invoking the idea that the movement to establish Israel was like America's revolution, that they too were throwing off the reins of British imperialism, that the Jewish settlers were like the Puritans who fled persecution in Europe. But when Zionist ideologues are talking amongst themselves, they usually are not talking about America very much at all. They're usually invoking colonial projects in Africa, Theodore Herzl being a fan of Cecil Rhodes in particular. So are there many parallels you see with Israel's founding and America's founding, or is the more correct parallel being those white settler republics in southern Africa, places like Rhodesia?
I would see a bit of both. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking of an article that appeared in the Journal of Foreign Affairs some months ago by the popular Israeli contemporary writer Tom Segev, I think his name is. And he's looking at the origins of Zionism. And he points out that the man who could be considered the founding father of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, I believe the major airport is still named after him. When he arrived from Europe in historic Palestine, and of course many of our sympathizers with Israel try to convince us that many of the founders were of socialist orientation. Sometimes they point to a man like Ben-Gurion. But according to the Foreign Affairs article, one of the first things that Ben-Gurion tried to do when he arrived was to compel Jewish employers to hire only Jewish workers, for example. And I was thinking to myself, that's a hell of a socialist if he's going to be called a socialist. But from the point of view of Zionism, which is a form of nationalism, that makes a kind of sense. In the sense that if you're trying to build a Jewish state, that's not necessarily an ecumenical project. And so likewise, in North America, you had similar divisions with regard to the laboring population. I've already made reference to the unpaid sector of the working class, which was heavily, disproportionately of African ancestry, and the paid sector, which was disproportionately of European ancestry. And even in the 20th century, you had so-called hate strikes, whereby the working class, predominantly European ancestry, would engage in what they call hate strikes when employers tried to hire Negroes, for example. I would argue that part of the project today in the United States of the right wing, dare I say the MAGA movement, is that they're willing to accept quite a bit of corruption on the part of the leaders of that movement, including the current occupant of the White House, as long as they deliver with regard to turning the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on its head. That is to say, coming into being in the 1960s as a way to ferret out anti-Black racism in the workforce, and now the mandate supposedly is to ferret out what they consider to be so-called anti-whiteness, or, for example, the overthrow of affirmative action, the attack on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is seen, I dare say, by many in the Trump base as delivering what they thought that they were voting for, and therefore they're willing to tolerate quite a bit as long as those deliverables are recorded. It reminds me of the work I've done on the anti-apartheid movement, in the sense that the African majority was willing to absorb quite a bit of pain, including the indirect pain delivered by sanctions accorded by the United States of America, because they had a larger goal in mind. And I think that if you turn that situation on its head, you'll see that many in the Trump base, they're willing to absorb quite a bit of pain, including apparently high gas prices, as long as they can see the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I would argue that it's embodied in a number of book titles, that there have been a number of counter-revolutions that have led to the formation of the United States of America. And the similarity between revolution and counter-revolution is that the base of each project oftentimes feels that they can absorb pain as long as they can envision a different outcome at the end of the day. And to that extent, to return to the thread of your question, I see parallels between Israel and Southern Africa and Israel and the United States, in the sense that privileged settler classes establish themselves, oftentimes against the will of those not so privileged, which then leads to bitter conflict. And as we see in the United States, it can lead to compromise, such as what the United States endured in the 1950s and 1960s. But oftentimes those compromises are not long-standing because they're going against the essence and the thrust of why the project was established in the first instance.
I'm glad you brought up counter-revolutions, because something Dylan mentioned a while back on a previous discussion was the idea that Israel exists as essentially an expeditionary force for the United States and its imperial policy, in the same way that the West Bank settler movement in Israel acts as an expeditionary force for the state, where they do outrageous, illegal acts to settle land, but that gives the government the opportunity to move the Overton window toward greater and greater expansionist rhetoric. And looking back in your work, as you said, you talk about counter-revolutions a lot, and in particular, you've written about the Texas Revolution, the counter-revolution of 1836. And I felt like I saw a lot of parallels with that phenomenon. Can you detail why the Texas Revolution, why it was a counter-revolutionary effort, and what ramifications extended far past its admission as a state in the Union.
Well, what's remarkable is that the book, The Counterrevolution of 1836 about Texas, has received much less pushback than the Counterrevolution of 1776, even though those in 1836, in more ways than one, they thought that they were walking in the footsteps of 1776. The way that London was demonized in 1776, Mexico City was demonized, but from their point of view, it was even more dramatic, since the president of Mexico during the time of perhaps the bitterest contestation was a man of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, who, along with others, had moved to abolish slavery south of the border. You may recall that not only did you have Somerset's case in 1772 in London, which tended to raise questions about the viability, certainly of slavery in London, and if there's questions about the viability of slavery in the mother country, you can readily infer that there can be questions about the viability of slavery in the colonies, such as the 13 colonies. And of course, by the way, there were more than 13 colonies, and one of my current projects looks at British East Florida, which did not revolt at that particular time. And one of my arguments is going to be is because of the pre-existing Spanish culture, which involved the arming of Africans, for example, who had flexed their muscles in 1739 at Stono's Revolt in South Carolina, one of the bloodiest slave revolts in colonial British North America. And I should also say, just to reference something else for your audience, that within a day or two, and we're speaking in early June 2026, I'll be publishing a review essay in the New York-based publication The Nation that deals with some of these questions. And in that essay, I point out how there's a basic schism right now with regard to how 1776 is viewed. The 1619 Project of the New York Times, Ishmael Reed, perhaps our most prolific author, 88 years old in Oakland, California, has done a send-up of Hamilton, the Broadway come Disney extravaganza, pivoted around the question of slavery. The late Tyler Stovall, who was one of the most garlanded historians in the United States, certainly one of the most garlanded Black historians, a former president of the American Historical Association, his last book, White Freedom, says it all as he examines 1776. And so 1836 is parallel to 1776. And in fact, if you look at the last footnote of the introduction to that text, you'll find a rather sobering paragraph which deals with all of the indigenous peoples in Texas who were liquidated as a result of 1836. It reminds me, excuse me for chuckling, because obviously it's not funny, but it reminds me of when a previous U.S. administration engaged in drone warfare, oftentimes killing U.S. nationals. And part of the idea was that if you just detain them, and then they hire lawyers, movements can be built around them, etc. Whereas if you liquidate them, well, that's generally the end of the story. People today in Texas hardly realize that they are residing on blood-soaked land because so many of the victims are not around to clamor and protest. And likewise, independent Texas, because Texas established itself as an independent republic, and in fact, as I point out in the book, saw itself as challenging the United States of America, believe it or not. And in that context, think of the width and breadth of Texas. If you travel to eastern New Mexico, say New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and then start driving across the border into Texas, you'll see a sign that says 800 miles to the Louisiana border. That's 800 miles is about the distance, to put it in context, between, say, New York and Chicago. So this is a huge piece of real estate. And the Lone Star flag could be found off the coast of Cuba, off the coast of Brazil, off the coast of Angola, because they began to import enslaved Africans on a really rapid basis. Texas was a leader in terms of the Confederate States of America was probably the state least damaged by the Civil War, the Confederate state least damaged by the U.S. Civil War. And in fact, that brings me to a particular issue of mine is the question of Juneteenth, wherein we're told that in Galveston, June 19th, 1865, the Negroes did not know that they were free, even though the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply in Texas, because Texas was part of the Confederate States of America. Basically, what happens is that the enslavers in Texas wanted to continue slavery. And they were going to do it in league with the puppet leader Maximilian, who was installed in Mexico City and then had begun making overtures to the Texians, as they oftentimes call themselves. And they were going to try to reverse the abolitionist decrees. And when the men in blue of the federal U.S. Army showed up in Galveston, in part, they were trying to squash that kind of project. And in fact, Maximilian was then overturned, dislodged, and executed. There's a famous picture, in fact, of his being executed by patriotic Mexican forces on June 19th, 1867. And that's one of the many reasons I mark Juneteenth, because that particular Juneteenth, June 19th, 1867, does really mark an end, to a degree, of the slavery project in North America. Although I should say, and this is in a forthcoming book, that less than 10 years later, you had Confederate soldiers dispatched by Egypt to invade Ethiopia, because the whole slavery project, even though it may have been defeated in North America, began to relocate to Africa, for example, to Brazil, where slavery only ended in 1888, to the South Seas, where you had this process known as blackbirding, which was kind of enslavement project involving Melanesians and Polynesians. And the Hawaii Kingdom sought to intervene. Independent Hawaii Kingdom sought to intervene, and for their troubles that led to their overthrow in the 1890s and their incorporation as the 50th U.S. state, presumed final state in 1959. And so just to conclude this elongated response, let me say that, yes, there are many lessons to be learned from an examination of Texas, and we should not see it as coincidental that in many ways Texas is in the vanguard of the right wing and even neo-fascist movement in the United States of America. And once again, in terms of trying to connect the past to the present, I don't think you can understand that present without understanding some of the bloody past of Texas.
Thank you so much for that. Really just a fascinating answer. And I'm glad that you brought up the internationalization of slavery and related forms of exploitation after the Civil War, because I think there's also a parallel internationalization of Indian removal in a way. I mean, the frontier closes, but the settler colonial project of the United States doesn't really end. The U.S. starts its empire and starts waging its Indian wars abroad in the Philippines, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I think you're absolutely correct that kind of failure to reckon with these core original sins permeates our political culture today, and people just kind of keep wanting to ignore it or sweep it under the rug or pretend that it's been solved when it really hasn't. But I think that there are many people on the left who can see the founding for what it was, but still there is a desire to find a kind of redeeming national mythology in the United States. And I think for those people, the first attempt to do that comes with the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, and the attempt with the radical Republicans and others to effect a refounding of sorts with the project of Reconstruction, and in particular the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And this historical reinterpretation is, of course, grounded in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who you have studied and written on extensively. Historically speaking, of course, any attempt at a refounding was destroyed. The Confederacy may have lost the war, but really, as we've been talking about, spiritually it survived. And the Reconstruction amendments were systematically gutted. But I think beyond that, attempts to salvage that historical possibility and form an American identity has some real problems. For one, the idea of free labor, quote unquote free labor, and expanding the liberation promised by the 13th Amendment to so-called wage slavery in addition to chattel slavery rests on a kind of false equivalence. But also, the idea of free labor in practical terms at the time is premised on the continued dispossession of those living beyond the frontier, right? In the 19th century, that was westward expansion and the Homestead Act. But today it continues in the form of unequal exchange. So I'm just curious, what are your assessments? What are your views on the attempts to ground a political project today in restoring the revolutionary potential of Reconstruction and that era and the victory of the Union in the Civil War?
Well, as you correctly suggest, I've spent a lot of time writing about W.B. Du Bois and reading his work. But as I say, once again, in an essay that was published some months ago in The Nation, the weakness of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is that it really doesn't grapple with the indigenous question, which is a flaw of many of those who inspired us in the 20th century in the United States. There seems to be a blind spot. The indigenous question and the dispossession and the liquidation is sort of normalized. But obviously, I think that's a mistake, not only on moral and humanitarian grounds, but I don't think you can begin to understand class collaboration and opportunism without understanding how there were some poor settler descendants who stood to benefit from seizing the land. What I just said about my upcoming book on the Pacific Northwest, where a number of poor Europeans were able to get the land of the Cayuse and the Palouse. Second of all, with regard to the refounding, obviously, to connect the past to the present, the 6-person majority in the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't tend to accept that principle. They believe in originalism only with regard to the 18th century Constitution, not with regard to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, for example. And I think that they're able to do that because, to a degree, they're reflecting a majority position amongst settler descendants. In other words, it's not just a flaw, although certainly it is, in the thinking of the 6-person conservative majority, but they have a mass base that accepts practically, if not legally, that kind of contortion. And in any case, if you look at the 15th Amendment on suffrage, the Supreme Court, by eviscerating and gutting the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and their recent Calais versus Louisiana decision, has shown that they don't necessarily accept that concept of refounding. Otherwise, they would have upheld the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And still to be decided and determined, perhaps by the time you go to air, is birthright citizenship, which lies at the heart of the 14th Amendment. That is to say, those who are born in the United States are U.S. nationals, U.S. citizens, subject to a few provisos meant to overturn the Dred Scott decision of 1857. And one has to wonder if birthright citizenship is overturned, which guts, in a sense, the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was meant to overturn Dred Scott. Well, then what does that mean in terms of the Civil War? What does it mean in terms of the presence of Black people in the United States, particularly since myself and others have written quite a bit about the repetitive attempts to expel the Black population of the United States. And oftentimes, those who are critical of these immigrationist projects, like the Garvey movement, the World War I era of the 1920s, Marcus Garvey being the Jamaican who comes to the United States and organizes this Black nationalist movement. And one of the props in their platform was migration to Africa. But in some ways, as I see it, the Garvey movement was determining that you should jump before you're pushed. Because simultaneously, you had members of Congress, particularly from Dixie, seeking to expel the Black population to Congo, for example. The scholar Timothy Mason Roberts, in his latest book on Algeria, talks about the attempt to expel the Black population to Algeria. There were attempts to, you mentioned the Philippines, attempts to expel the Black population to the Philippines, for example. And that's part of the problem today, because needless to say, there's a lot of disgruntlement in the Black population in the United States, as well there should be. But for various reasons, and I would say because of the attack on Black studies and the attack on an accurate rendering of history, there's little comprehension of the historical roots of why that disgruntlement exists.
Something that always strikes me about looking back on how leftist movements in the U.S. used to operate, something you write a lot about in Armed Struggle, ? Is how steeped in internationalism that project used to be, how it was considered as integral to the movement as the sun is integral to the sky. And I think a common refrain from critics in the conservative world would be to pin this on malign influence from the Soviet Union or from China, that they were simply paid to draw these connections, that they weren't honest in their beliefs. But why did leftist groups, why did many black leftist organizations in particular, see internationalism as so all-important to their cause? What did they do to try to develop that, and what led to it losing its importance to the movement?
Well, with regard to internationalism, let's look at the 20th century to begin with. And I think that when the Black left, symbolized by the late, great Paul Robeson, for example, multilingual singer, actor, socialist, that whether they acknowledged it or not, it was a reflection of the balance of forces in the United States of America. Recall what I just said about that 77 million, for example, or recall another historical example I oftentimes cite in talking about the Voting Rights Act, the fact that in the early 1990s, David Duke, a leading Nazi and Klansman, got a majority of the Euro-American vote, 55%, and running for governor. Took a massive turnout from the Black community to make sure he did not ascend to the highest office in the land of Louisiana, in Baton Rouge. And so it was a reflection of needing support internationally, because oftentimes you felt you did not have sufficient support at home. In fact, another point that I've written about that has been lost sight of was that there was sharp conflict in the 1920s and the 1930s and perhaps part of the 1940s within the Black community amongst different internationalist factions. That is to say, the Black nationalist factions were pro-Tokyo. If you look at the Nation of Islam, it really starts off as being very close to Japan. The concept of the Asiatic black man, which some of these rappers today still invoke, although I'm not sure they understand why they're invoking it. It comes out of this relationship with Tokyo. But then obviously that perished in August 6th, August 9th, 1945, with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then you had the rise of Malcolm in the post-World War II era, who began to reorient the Black nationalists away from Asia and towards Africa, which was surging to independence. And obviously, the United States was quite concerned about that. And that creates a dynamic that then leads the United States to make an agonizing retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, because of a concern about how the socialist camp would gain leverage in Africa and its vast resources, not to mention the Caribbean nearby, the bauxite of Jamaica, the petroleum of Trinidad and Tobago. Now we see, of course, the petroleum of Guyana, the only English-speaking nation in South America. So that creates this dynamic that leads to an agonizing retreat from Jim Crow, and also leads to the United States seeking to woo Africans by opening the doors of higher education to African students, like Barack Obama Sr., who matriculates at the University of Hawaii, beginning in the late 1950s, early 1960s, for example. Other students coming to Howard University, the historically Black school in Washington, D.C., and these Nigerians and Jamaicans, et cetera, they're difficult to distinguish phenotypically from Black Americans. And so if they're manhandled and roughhoused by the Washington, D.C. police, that creates diplomatic incidents, which then creates a dynamic which leads to a certain lessening, at least for a while, of that kind of pulverizing process. Now, I've talked about the 20th century, but we could take this back to where we began with regard to Black soldiers disproportionately siding with the Redcoats when the Republic was founded. The War of 1812, you have a similar phenomenon with a number of the Redcoats being men of ebony hue, particularly in the sacking of Washington, D.C. in August 1814, for example, sending President James Madison and his guerrilla spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets. And obviously, this sort of dynamic creates a certain kind of resentment to the black population. They're seen as enemies within the gates, which then leads to a further crackdown upon them. But what are they to do? That's part of the plaint in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction when he's talking about the demise of Reconstruction. I mean, what are the options? I mean, the options seem to be rather limited because on the one hand, you can forge these international alliances for progress, but if you don't maintain these alliances, and even if you do maintain these alliances, it contributes to resentment amongst the settler descendant population and an attempt to pulverize and penalize you even more. And then that brings us to 2026 when, as part of what I call the compromise of 1954, where you had these black internationalists like Robeson who were sidelined, his income falls from the six figures to the low four figures during the Red Scare period. And in return, their anti-Jim Crow concessions, the aforementioned Voting Rights Act of 1965, Civil Rights Act of 1964, but now they're in the process of being gutted, if they haven't been gutted already. And historical memory of many does not extend to recalling how we got to this place. That is to say, by a ditching of internationalism. And as myself and many others say, that leaves many of our leaders and intellectuals in the position of being able to sing the blues, but not having necessarily any remedies for the blues.
I wanted to talk about the very present here, the current quagmire that the U.S. is involved in with regards to its war / I suppose, indefinite ceasefire with Iran. Because you've spoken before on a couple of different places, I think, about how this is America's Suez moment. Mm-hmm. Referring to Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal in the 50s and the failed attempt by the faltering British and French empires to reimpose control. This is also something that the Iranians have been noticing themselves. I read during the war multiple editorials in newspapers like Kayhan and Dunya Iqtisad, where writers brought up that America's Suez moment seemed fast approaching. But even if the comparisons feel pretty clear, America and its allies are in different positions than the belligerent parties were in the late 50s. Britain and France were certainly faltering, but they still controlled vastly more territory and had much larger militaries, and they're staying out of this war pretty firmly. Israel is much more military powerful today, but lacks the kind of on-the-ground fighting prowess it had back in the 50s and 60s. And America has never been more armed to the teeth, but it is falling from what feels like a much more dangerous height as it tries to find a way to successfully land its imperial decline. Can you detail what were the ramifications for both Egypt and these colonial powers during that crisis? What potential futures did it foreclose for Britain, for France, for Israel? And what futures do you believe this crisis in Hormuz will foreclose to America and Israel?
Well, first of all, with regard to Egypt, the coming to power of Nasser in the early 1950s was really a political earthquake. And the overthrow of Farouk, whose corpulence, in a sense, was also symbolic of the excesses, the negative excesses of his corrupt regime. I mean, as I might have mentioned a moment or two ago, some of the predecessors of Farouk were actually trying to establish a kind of empire in Africa, heading towards the equator. That's why the Confederate soldiers were there in 1875. And then Egypt winds up in the anomalous position of helping to dislodge Ottoman Turkish rule. Ottoman Turkey, by that point, was the sick man of Europe. And in fact, in the 1830s, the colonized Egypt had almost overthrown the colonizer, the Ottoman Turkish regime. But then, by 1882, Britain steps in. And Britain, in a sense, is colonizing Egypt. But then Egypt is still trying to establish this empire heading towards the equator, which leads to the so-called Anglo-Egyptian condominium ruling Sudan, a country along with Congo, which has probably been tortured more savagely than any other country on planet Earth. And a lot of it is at the hands of the Egyptians, I'm afraid to say, at least in the 19th century. Now, with Nasser coming to power, the script is flipped. I mean, as I said in an earlier book, Cairo becomes sort of an anti-colonial lodestar under Nasser. It's helping to sponsor revolt in Algiers, leading to independence in 1962. It's helping to sponsor revolt in Kenya, leading to independence in 1963. And this is one of the reasons why Britain, France, and Israel in 1956 are trying to not only seize the Suez Canal, but topple Nasser. They saw that as being in their long-term interest, and from a certain point of view, it was. Now, with regard to Britain, it drew the lesson from the Suez debacle that it should tie its apron strings ever tighter and closer to that of Uncle Sam. But there might be evidence in 2026 that that's being rethought, not least Mr. Trump. He does not necessarily embrace the so-called special relationship, the North Atlantic alliances, for example, which leads to his pummeling, at least rhetorically, of NATO, where France takes the opposite point of view, that it needs to develop more independently. And there's reason for that, because if you look at Algeria, for example, then Senator Kennedy gets a lot of traction in the late 1950s from the idea that the United States should not necessarily be in bed with France on the Algiers question. And that gives Paris reason to be suspicious of Washington. And certainly under Charles de Gaulle, remember Charles de Gaulle actually comes to Quebec and helps to stir the pot of separatism just north of the border of the United States of America. I've noticed parenthetically that during his trips to the United States, maybe coincidence, President Macron oftentimes visits Louisiana. I haven't seen any words of what he said in Louisiana, but Louisiana, New Orleans used to be part of France up until about 1803, 1804, for example. Now, with regard to the Suez moment for the United States, I think that that's likely true. As a matter of fact, I said on a radio broadcast the other day that the only question is whether this strategic disaster for Washington will be gigantic or simply major. That's really the only question that needs to be determined. That means a lot in terms of the global alignment of forces. It means a lot with regard to the United States' relationship with China and Russia and the European Union, perhaps Africa, perhaps Latin America. As a matter of fact, on this same broadcast, I pointed out that if you look at the national security strategy of 2025 in the United States, it stressed the so-called Dunroe Doctrine, hence the abduction of Maduro January 3rd, 2026, the attempted indictment of officials in Mexico as we speak, a Trump donor being in the pole position to become the next president of Colombia, for example. So it has major ramifications, but with regard to the U.S. domestic population, I'm not sure if the news is all bright. The working class, the poor, in part because of an inability or unwillingness to grapple with global questions, understand the connection between the global and the domestic. But we shall see, because the conditions might compel better understanding. At least I'm hoping it does.
I think that leads us to a good place to close, which is an assessment of the left in the United States. I think it's safe to say that in the past decade and a half or so, there has been a resurgence of self-identified socialism across broad swaths of the constituencies that traditionally constitute the Democratic Party. And that's particularly true among younger generations. And this has been marked by key moments of inflection in recent history. Occupy Wall Street after the 2008 financial crisis, the two waves of mass mobilization in response to police killing, the first one in 2014 and then again in 2020. And then more recently, the massive popular response to the US-backed Israeli genocide starting in 2023. Several politicians have emerged on the backs of these movements and have attempted to translate that energy into reformist efforts within the Democratic Party and ultimately within the nation as a whole. And I'm thinking, of course, of Bernie Sanders, but also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Zohran Mamdani now in New York, and most recently, Graham Plattner up in Maine. These figures have all, in slightly different ways, sought to center working class politics in their messaging, both as a prescription, but also in different ways as a description of the United States and its history. I'm thinking in particular of AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, recently argued that the American Revolution was a working class uprising and that we need to reclaim that spirit. So I'm curious what you make of these efforts. And as a historian, do you have any lessons to offer for those who seem maybe somewhat inclined to paper over the real nature and history of this country?
Well, Mamdani obviously has a difficult road to hoe. That came clear in the last few days when he chose not to march on the Israel Day march on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, was denounced and excoriated, and then Smotrich, a presumed war criminal, and his coterie were marching alongside the governor of New York, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Attorney General Tish James, etc. They were somewhat apologetic that they were in the line of march with Smotrich, but I don't necessarily accept their explanations because it's an Israel Day march. I mean, he's a ranking official, so of course you expect either him or one of his comrades to be in the march. But that also bespeaks, once again, the difficult road to hoe for Mr. Mamdani, who was forced to reappoint Jessica Tisch as police commissioner, a member of the 1% in good standing, who also was part of that march, relates to past lessons of struggle. And I think that bespeaks the kind of difficulty that these social democratic politicians like Mamdani will have in the United States of America, particularly if they're executive positions. Now, if you're in a legislative position like AOC and Bernie, that's a horse of a different color. Because you're in AOC, she's in a House of Representatives, 435 members. She only has one vote. Bernie, Senate of 100 members, he only has one vote. Say Plattner comes in, maybe that's 2 votes. But executive power is a horse of a different color, as opposed to legislative power. And then there are others who are waiting in the wings to surge forward. At least I would think, if you look at the recent congressional election in northern New Jersey, perhaps the senatorial race in Michigan, for example. But once again, these are all legislative positions. Executive power, that is the reins of power we should be trying to grasp. Now, in terms of lessons, I mean, I think it's just like people on the left. They don't keep up with the history. It's like, or keep up with the literature. I mean, it's as if people in the 1930s were not keeping up with Du Bois and Black Reconstruction. They still had an antiquated view. You know, it's a line from the International, you know, the working class anthem, that at least in English says, "Tradition's chains have bound us." And I think with regard to the left in the United States, because we've had such giants, fortunately, historically. And so if Paul Robeson didn't challenge 1776, well, then why should I challenge 1776, for example? But that's sort of anti-historical, sort of anti-scientific. It's like, you know, we can never learn new lessons, which is anti-intellectual to begin with, anti-scientific, anti-political. So I think that, to answer your question, one of the lessons I would make to this new crop of left-leaning politicians is, you know, keep up with the literature. I mean, it won't lead to these flaws. For example, I was critical of Senator Sanders. He told the New York Times in November 2024 that the reason that Trump won was because identity politics. Now, I'm not sure what that means, but, you know, he used to live in Israel, for example. And here's a state where politics is based upon an ethno-religious identity. Now, if that's not identity politics, I don't know what is. And, you know, many of us on the left, we've been talking about this. But if you're not keeping up, you're still using these antiquated concepts to explain complicated realities. So I know that these politicians, they have to read all these bills and reports and congressional testimony, et cetera. But perhaps they could designate someone on their staff to keep up with current debates so that these sorts of mistakes and errors do not recur.
Dr. Horne, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really excellent conversation, and we're very grateful that you shared your time with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.